Hello, everybody. Welcome back to AP World History. Welcome back, everybody. It's been a while, hasn't it? Yeah, it has been a while. Well, anyway, this is chapter 7. This is all about kind of the results, the aftermath, you could say, of the Mongols in China. We're going to look at the next major dynasty in Chinese history, the Ming Dynasty. I'll work on the screen right there. All right. So, yes, today we are going to look at the Ming Dynasty. We are going to see that many of the actions that the Ming Dynasty will do are kind of a rejection, you could say, of the Yuan Dynasty, of the Mongol Dynasty in China. So the lesson objective today is asking you to kind of think about what are the impacts culturally and intellectually of networks of exchange. And this is a really complicated question when it comes to China because there is going to be intellectual and cultural diffusion into China during the Ming Dynasty, but it's not going to be along the Silk Road, actually. It's going to mostly be through trade in the Indian Ocean, but also trade with other East Asian societies. So pay attention to examples of science, pay attention to examples of culture, and how these things are impacted by the outside world. If you want to get really complicated with it, you could make the argument that because of the unpopularity of the Mongols, there was a rejection of outside influences. That could be another way to answer this lesson objective. All right, so let's look at the Ming Dynasty. Let's look at the early Ming Dynasty. Well, let's refresh ourselves where the Ming come from. Well, the Ming Dynasty are going to be the dynasty that appears in China following the Yuan Dynasty. Remember, the Yuan Dynasty was the Mongol dynasty in China. And as we saw with the Yuan Dynasty, there were a lot of changes. But a lot of these changes are going to kind of be reversed under the Ming Dynasty. Because the Ming Dynasty, it emerges in the Red Turban revolts in the 1830s and 1368. Sorry, in A-Push, we're talking about the 1830s. The Ming Dynasty is going to emerge thanks to the Red Turban Revolt. And the Ming Dynasty, as we're going to see in just a second, is largely going to reject outside foreign influences and restore traditional Chinese influences. And you can call this a variety of different things. You could say it's isolationist, you could say it's xenophobic, but what we do know is that China is going to heavily restrict outside influences in its country during the Ming Dynasty. And we largely are going to see that the intellectual basis for this is Neo-Confucianism. Remember, Neo-Confucianism, it tends to be stricter, isolationist. It tends to be opposed to foreigner influence in China, more in favor of native Chinese philosophy, native Chinese religion. So the Ming Dynasty, in accordance with these very isolationist, anti-foreign influence, is going to kind of bring back a lot of Chinese political influences that existed prior to the Mongols. Remember, the Mongols changed a lot of things. They brought in foreigners to work in government. I said foreigners really weirdly, but they brought in Islamic scholars to help administer government. They brought in Central Asian nomads to help out with the army. But under the Ming Dynasty, we are going to see a lot of these influences end. So let's look at ways that this is ending. Well, for one thing, the Ming are going to be rather aggressive towards Central Asian nomads, to the remnants of the Mongol Empire that fled up north into Central Asia. We do see that the Ming are going to demand tribute from these Central Asian nomads, largely kind of a way to punish these Mongols for ever daring invading China. So the tribute system, that's a callback to the Tang Dynasty that's going to come back, where Central Asian nomads have to pay tribute to the Chinese. But we also see that the Mongols are going to, or excuse me, the Chinese are going to get rid of that Mongol practice of using paper money. Paper money was kind of used by the Mongols in China to encourage overland trade, but it caused inflation. That's why the Ming are going to go back to metal-based currency. Initially, they use a metal-based currency, a copper and iron alloy, but eventually they are going to really want silver as the basis for their currency. They want metal because it's rarer to get. They're going to control who produces metal, and they are going to try and clamp down on counterfeits. They really want to restrict the paper money supply to eliminate inflation. But how else are we seeing changes under the Ming Dynasty? Well, we are largely going to see that the Ming, much like what we'll see in Korea and later on in Japan, are going to adopt a policy known as isolation. The Chinese name for that, or well, roughly, is Haijin. So the practice of Haijin is going to be the cultural and political idea of restricting the foreign presence in China. And we see this actually carried out in a variety of different ways. For one thing, the Ming are going to limit overland trade. They're basically going to stop China's participation in the Silk Road. And instead, they are going to heavily favor that China dominate Southeast and Indian Ocean trade. Southeast Asian, I should say. And really, that's because the Chinese are looking to control that trade. They don't really want outsiders coming into China, bringing in all of their ideas, all of their culture. They really want to maintain that Chinese isolation. So there is still going to be maritime trade in the Indian Ocean, in Southeast Asia, in East Asia in general. So there is strong trade connections still continuing. There's a continuity right there between, say, China, Korea, and Japan. But we do see that despite the fact that China is still engaged in overseas trade, that there are going to be a lot of limits on foreign merchants within the Ming Dynasty, within Ming China. And we largely see that through policies that restrict and kind of control where foreigners can live, where foreign merchants can live. They have to seek permission from the Chinese government to trade in China. For example, any prospective Muslim merchant from Southeast Asia, say, they would need to seek permission from the Chinese government, from the Chinese emperor. And they would also need to show that they respect the Chinese government. They would need to perform a ceremony in which the outsiders, the foreigners, they would have to do a kowtow. And a kowtow essentially is a ritualistic bowing towards one's superior, one's authority, one's social better. So we do see the practice of the kowtow in which a kind of individual goes all the way to the floor, puts their forehead on the ground as a sign of respect. That is a very Neo-Confucian sort of ideology, and it's going to be forced-ish upon foreigners seeking to do business in China. But another thing we are seeing return in China, and one that very much embodies these Neo-Confucian ideas, is going to be a civil service exam. It comes back, baby. You thought it was gone under the Yuan Dynasty? You were wrong, you imbecile. Just kidding, you're all intelligent people. So the civil service is going to return under the Ming Dynasty, and it's going to, again, embody those Neo-Confucian practices, those Neo-Confucian ideas. You have to read the Neo-Confucian texts. You've got to read Confucius's book, The Analects. And this is going to have an impact of kind of reintroducing the scholar gentry back into China. Remember, they were gone under the Yuan Dynasty. Merchants are going to fall as the dominant social class. They're back on bottom again, baby. And yet, we do see that there are some continuities with the Ming and the Yuan Dynasty. The Ming Dynasty is going to keep, actually, that province system that the Yuan introduced. The only difference is, guess who's in charge of these provinces? It's not Mongol nobles, it's members of the scholar gentry. And remember, the scholar gentry, that is a term that describes individuals who passed the civil service exam and now are in Chinese government. So let's look at other reforms under the Ming. Well, for one thing, they're going to move the capital to Nanjing. Not all that important, all things considered. But they are going to kind of introduce a very strict government system, a very strict government policies, especially aimed at maintaining that Confucian hierarchy. And we see kind of the incorporation of legalism. It's a callback to Unit 0. Legalism, remember, that kind of more or less authoritarian ideology in which all obedience has to be towards the state. And that's going to be something that comes back actually under the Ming Dynasty. We see that Neo-Confucianism will incorporate legalistic ideas and stress obedience to the emperor. So we see a return of centralization. And this centralized government is very much going to try and enforce its absolute control in China. We see that there is a policy of censorship, of anti-Ming literature, of pro-foreigner literature. Exiling comes back. People accused of corruption, people convicted of corruption as well, are going to be subject to public beatings. So we do see that there is a system of stricter authoritarianism that is kind of an embodiment of calling back to previous legalism, previous legalistic thought in China. And a result of kind of the return of the civil service exam, a result of this very strict authoritarian style-ish government, we do see that social divisions will increase, especially economic classes. We will see kind of the return of the scholar gentry, the decline of the merchant class, and we do see very strict assurance that peasants have to follow these rules. All right, and that's a public beating right there, in case you were curious. I think we should bring that back. Just kidding. All right, what else is changing in China? Well, politically, we see the return of these previous Neo-Confucian ideas of the civil service exam. We see the return of legalism, actually, that's incorporated into Neo-Confucianism. But we're also going to see that the Ming will discourage foreign culture. So in a way, that's kind of a reversal on that lesson objective, that idea of networks of exchange impacting cultures across Eurasia, Afro-Eurasia. Well, in the case of China, they're largely going to reject these outside influences that might have emerged in China under the Yuan Dynasty, under the Ming. So the Ming going to very much discourage foreign culture. And we do see that in China, mostly to kind of that amplifies this anti-foreigner idea, is going to be the return of this idea of China being the so-called Middle Kingdom. And the Middle Kingdom is a political, cultural idea that China essentially is the center or middle of the world. It's the Middle Kingdom. And that everybody on the periphery are a bunch of barbarians. I think that's true, quite frankly. So the Middle Kingdom is a notion that will kind of be very popular among Confucian scholars, among the Chinese cultural elite in general under the Ming Dynasty. This is kind of the intellectual reason why foreigners are so restricted. It's because they're outsiders. They're foreigners who are going to destroy our perfect Chinese culture. And we see that kind of as a result of this return of Neo-Confucianism, that's going to impact gender roles. Because remember, under the Mongols, women had a lot more say than societies we've seen in much of Afro-Eurasia. Women had political, or not really political, but social equality, economic equality. All of this kind of relative equality existed when the Mongols were in China. But remember, Neo-Confucianism believes in these ideas of strict family organization, that children should be obedient to their parents, that women should be obedient to men, that husbands should be superior to women, to their wives, etc. So the status of women is actually going to decline under the Ming Dynasty. Foot binding comes back as a practice for the elite. And yet elite women do have a lot, or at least relatively, a lot more freedoms than poor Chinese women. Poor Chinese women are subject to this class hierarchy and this gender hierarchy, whereas elite women, they can influence their husbands. They can have some political say as advisors to a degree. We do see kind of a softening of some of these things under one of the most famous, most prominent Ming emperors, a guy by the name of Yang Li. I'm saying his name wrong. I apologize to all you Yang Li fans out there. But what is significant about this particular emperor? Well, we do see an easing of some of these very strict ideas, these very xenophobic, very isolationist ideas under this particular emperor. We do see actually some former Mongol practices return. We see the province system comes back. That's when it happens under this particular emperor. We see that the capital goes back to the city of Beijing, which the Mongols created. And we see in Beijing, actually, that the center of government is structured and centered in the Forbidden City, which, remember, was built under the Mongols, under Kublai Khan. And we actually do see that this is a time period in which China is going to try and aggressively expand into the Indian Ocean system. And we do see that kind of this wealth that is generated under Yongle, thanks to the Indian Ocean system, is going to contribute to a cultural golden age. We do see that Yongle will patronize or sponsor art and culture and science. In the scientific realm, we see the creation of the encyclopedia. The encyclopedia, I'm sure you know what an encyclopedia is, but it's a big old book or series of books that contain information about any possible subject under the sun. That's, you won't get that joke yet. Never mind. So the encyclopedia is something that is going to be compiled under Yongle. It's sponsored by the government. It represents kind of how the Chinese government is encouraging scientific development. But we also see in the realm of scientific development increased exploration of the Indian Ocean under Yongle. That's probably the most important reason why he's significant, is that he is going to sponsor these overseas explorations under the leadership of a Chinese admiral, a former Muslim actually, by the name of Zheng He. Zheng He is a very important figure who I'll talk about more later on. All right, so you should be able to describe political and cultural reforms under the Ming Dynasty. What's returning? That kind of answers that second question right there. How did the Ming either continue or discontinue Mongol policies in China? Continuity and change is a big deal in this class, my friends. All right, so let's look at other changes under the Ming Dynasty. And they also kind of reflect broader trends that we will see in other places. We'll talk about similarities with Europe in just a second, and then we'll also see how other trade networks will influence cultural and demographic changes. Let's first look at the economy under the Ming Dynasty. Well, we do see, especially towards the end of the Ming Dynasty, as we get closer to the 1600s, we are going to see a loosening of trade restrictions. We will see China kind of come back to a degree, at least in overseas trade. They are going to be involved in trade. And eventually, we do see evidence of trade between China and European countries after the 1450s, European overseas merchants. And yet, despite the fact that we will see kind of a loosening of some restrictions on foreigners in China, we are going to still see that China primarily wants to be an exporting country. They want to maintain a favorable trade balance, meaning they want to export more than they import. And what is China exactly exporting and importing? Well, they're exporting the things we've discussed previously. They're exporting silk and tea and porcelain. Everybody wants these things. Manufactured goods are huge in China. If you didn't see that in the Silk Road simulation, I don't know what you saw. So manufactured goods, it's very important to remember East Asia, predominant manufacturer in the period prior to 1750. That's just a bit of a side information for you. However, what does China want? What is China going to import? What is it willing to trade for the stuff it produces? Well, China primarily wants to maintain its economic supremacy and prevent inflation by acquiring silver. And at first, silver is kind of rare to come by for Europeans, so it's rather difficult to get all this wonderful trade goodies that that China has. However, after 1492, Europe's going to stumble into a lot of silver, especially in the Americas. And we'll talk about that more in Unit 4, obviously. But what else is changing? Well, let's look at population in the Ming Dynasty. We do see a huge leap and jump in agricultural production under the Ming Dynasty. And a rule in AP World History. Better agriculture, meaning better agricultural technology and practices, leads to more food. More food means more people means urbanization. That's generally the rule of thumb in world history. And why do we see more food? Why do we see improved agricultural production under the Ming Dynasty? Well, environmentally speaking, we are going to see a general warming of Chinese climate actually in this kind of early modern period. We do see that the medieval warm period, something we'll talk about more with Europe, that's going to impact different places differently and at different times. That was a stupid statement, the way I said that. But it is going to impact China primarily in this 300-year period right here, in which we have generally warmer temperatures, which leads to improved agricultural production. Better conditions for farming means better farming. But we also see that after 1492, new crops are going to be introduced into China that will help out with population size, that will allow for sustainable population growth. And these new crops include things like corn, like potatoes, like peanuts. These things will help massively increase China's population. So baby corn comes to China around the time of 1492, and that process that we'll discuss later is the Columbian Exchange. Hopefully you've heard of it before. It's the easiest thing to ever know about, but we'll talk about it more in Unit 4. But what's the impact of all this improved agriculture, of this increased population? Well, better agriculture, better pizza, better ingredients leads to increased population. We do see a massive population increase in China during the Ming Dynasty and afterwards as well. For example, on this chart right here, you can see the general population trend of China up until the 1800s, actually. So 1300, about the start of this particular chapter. Under the early Ming Dynasty, we see kind of a population about 85 million. It was declined after, the Mongols invaded. But 85 million, that's a pretty impressive amount. By 1600, towards the end of the Ming Dynasty, we see a population growth to 120 million. And then by the 1800s, it's almost 300 million. It's almost 9,000. No, it's almost 300 million. The over 9,000 joke is... Anyway. But as usual, more people, more places they need to live, and then we see urbanization. So urbanization will generally increase towards the end of the Ming Dynasty. All right, that was cool and everything. Let's look at some economic kind of challenges that the Ming Dynasty will face, especially towards the end. This helps explain why they decline, and that's something we'll look at later in Unit 4. Well, we do see that there are signs of economic weakness, even going back to the early Ming Dynasty when they got rid of paper money. Because in their attempt to control currency, to make it harder to get and counterfeit, we do see that the Ming will heavily control metal production in the country. And that's going to have an impact of limiting iron tool production. And iron tools are needed by peasants to do everything. It's going to make iron tools a lot more expensive. Peasants have to pay higher prices. I almost say higher prices for tools. And that's going to kind of be a symbol of weakness, the fact that it's so hard for peasants to get the things they need for their everyday life. We also see that there's a general decline in overland trade, which is going to lead to a slowing of importing foreign technology. China's going to kind of still be the predominant manufacturing and technological mastermind of the early modern period. However, things are going to slow down because of this insistence on forbidding outside influences, thanks to Neo-Confucianism. And as we'll discuss more in Unit 4, a major sign of weakness for the Ming Dynasty is actually going to be the overproduction of silver. We will see a silver problem in China that is going to largely destroy that attempt to be more of an export country rather than an importing one. And that's going to allow for Europeans to start dominating Chinese trade. And we'll discuss the European presence in East Asia more in Unit 4. Because that's going to start by the end of Unit 2 and really pick up in Units 4 and 3. So that's the time period 1450 to 1750. But we do talk about culture in regards to this lesson objective. So what are some examples of that? Well, we do see that under emperors like Yongle, we see the sponsorship, the patronizing of culture. We also see that the trade with the outside world is going to help out with cultural production. So we do see kind of that trade with, say, places like Korea. That's going to introduce the printing technology, the printing press into China. And the Chinese public, especially these especially kind of elites, these scholar gentry, they are going to largely kind of want to purchase books. And books are easier to make now because of this new printing technology brought in from Korea, thanks to trade with East Asia. So we do see that popular novels will begin to develop. These popular novels are in kind of a new standardized language of Mandarin. Mandarin is going to become a very popular language, the almost de facto universal language in China, at least in the north. So we do see kind of this new literature emerging thanks to trade with Korea, which brought in the printing press. But we also see that the Ming are going to experience a kind of cultural golden age in ceramic production, in porcelain production. Another name for porcelain, by the way, is China, and then for good reason. We do see that thanks to trade with the Indian Ocean community, that dyes are coming into China. And these dyes are going to be heavily used in Ming Dynasty vases. And that's an example of one right there. Oftentimes in popular culture, you might hear, I mean, I can't think of an example, but there's going to be always this kind of idea of, oh, this is a precious Ming vase, a Ming vase produced during the Ming Dynasty. Oh, Last Crusade, Indiana Jones. There's an example of one. I don't know if you remember that, if any of you have seen that. Anyway, it's not important. But the Ming Dynasty is kind of experiencing a cultural golden age, and one example of that is these novels in popular language of Mandarin, but also these vases, these ceramic porcelain pots that are made using dye found from Indian Ocean trade. But we also see that China's manufacturing economy is going to actually lead to domestic demand for produced goods, such as silk robes. Silk robes are an example of a Chinese cultural product that will be enjoyed not only by people outside of China, thanks to trade, but also the Chinese themselves. But we also see that under the Ming Dynasty, we do have maritime exploration, at least under the exploration of Yongle. And Yongle is going to sponsor a series of expeditions, a series of voyages into the Indian Ocean led by a man by the name of Zheng He. And Zheng He was a Chinese admiral. His family was initially kind of Muslim Uyghurs. He eventually converts. I think his dad converts and he becomes a non-Muslim Chinese person, practicing Confucianism and all those Buddhist practices as well. Buddhism is acceptable at this point in Chinese history. Anyway, Zheng He is going to be a very trusty, loyal supporter of the emperor, of Yongle. And we do see that Yongle is going to sponsor Zheng He to engage in a series of overseas exploration in the Indian Ocean. And the goal of Zheng He is to document what he sees, but also to spread Chinese political, cultural, and economic influence. Basically, how is he going to do this? He's going to do this by getting a bunch of boats, like thousands of boats, tens of thousands of boats. Some of them are treasure vessels, meaning that they are boats filled with Chinese products, Chinese goods, like the bell rang, like silk and porcelain, like all these precious metals that China wants to show off to the world. But also, there's a bunch of gunboats as well. These gunboats have cannons, and basically, there is going to be this goal to create states that give stuff to the Ming Dynasty. So the creation of tribute states is a goal of Zheng He's explorations. But the Zheng He exploration is kind of an example of that intellectual impact of networks of exchange. For one thing, he's exploring and documenting what he sees, but he's also utilizing the astrolabe. And guess where the astrolabe is from, my friends? From the Middle East. from the Islamic world. That's going to be used by the Chinese. The Chinese are also employing their improved compass technology. They're going to employ their improved shipbuilding, the junk especially. And we do see that Zheng He is very successful. He's going to go everywhere. He's going to go from Southeast Asia. He's going to explore the Strait of Malacca. He's going to go into India at one point. He goes to the Middle East. He goes to Aden. He goes to East Africa, sets foot down there. And he's going to add a lot of tribute states to China. He is going to demonstrate how wealthy China is, how politically and militarily powerful it is. And China could have been the dominant Indian Ocean power. It could have wrested control away from Muslim merchants. It could have been the sole mover and shaker of Indian Ocean trade. It could have been the dominant ocean-based empire in general, before the Europeans even. And yet, we are going to see that all of this expedition will end in 1433, after Zheng He dies, after Yang Li dies. And there are a few reasons why, and historians can think of at least three. For one thing, there is going to be this overall concern about the cost of these expeditions. They weren't cheap. I mean, tens of thousands of junks going into the Indian Ocean with all of this massive amount of wealth. That's not a very cheap thing to do. So there is going to be probably financial struggles. We also see that there will be internal struggles by the end of the Ming Dynasty. There are threats of invaders from the outside. We do see the rise of a group of Central Asian nomads called the Manchu. We'll talk about them more later, but they're going to occasionally raid, not wanting to pay tribute. So China has other things to deal with other than going into the Indian Ocean. And yet another big reason is the return of Neo-Confucianism. After Yang Li dies, all of his kind of loosening, easing of Neo-Confucian practices are going to go away, and Neo-Confucian scholars come back with a vengeance. We do see the return of that idea of the Middle Kingdom, of xenophobia, of isolation. Why deal with the outside world? Why go through the cost of setting up tribute states in the Indian Ocean when we could just focus on ourselves? People want Chinese goods. We don't need to go out into the world. We can just stay here. So we do see that there will be an end to Zheng He's expeditions. But why is all of this important? Why is it relevant? Well, the significance is that China could have been the I'm very crazy today. Could have been the maritime power. It could have been an overseas empire. And yet, for the reasons I just said, it didn't. But who instead is going to come to dominate the Indian Ocean? Well, eventually, we will start to see the inclusion of Europeans after 1450. And we will explore this a lot more in Unit 4. So you should be able to kind of answer these questions here. How's the natural environment changing during the Ming Dynasty? What's the impact of that? And what were Zheng He and why why were Zheng He's voyages significant? All right, I'm just going to wrap up today by talking about Korea and Japan and a little bit of Vietnam as well, because these are societies that will also experience change thanks to the Mongols, actually. So let's look at Japan real quick. Well, the Mongols tried to invade Japan in the 1300s, the Yuan Dynasty specifically, but there were 2 typhoons and it never happened. So the Mongols attempted to invade, but they failed. LOL. But what does this mean for Japanese history? Well, there was the concern that it could have worked, that the Mongols could have invaded Japan. And yet, they didn't. We know that. But Japan is going to actually very briefly centralize in response to this potential Mongol threat. And we see actually the return of the emperor as the dominant centralized figure in Japanese society, at least very briefly for 3 years during the Kemmu Restoration. So remember that there was the shogunate in Japan, that it was very divided, it was very feudalistic, there was no centralized government. But in response to the potential for a Mongol invasion, we do see that there is more centralization, at least a brief attempt. However, this attempt is going to be resisted by the Ashikaga family. And the Ashiga family, they're going to declare war on the emperor. They're going to oust him from political authority and establish and reestablish a shogunate under their family. And this shogunate, this Ashiga shogunate, is going to be very decentralized. We see a brief return to centralization under the Kemmu Restoration, but then a return to decentralization. And this decentralization is filled with internal conflicts. We have the Onin War, or the Onion War, as I originally put in the unit outline until I changed it. So the Onin War, an example kind of this decentralization that still is occurring in Japan. Japan is going to briefly unify to resist the Mongols, and yet kind of without the Mongol actual threat being realized, things just go back to decentralization. And we do see actually that in this atmosphere of decentralization that Japan is going to be a bit more willing to engage in trade with the outside world, at least temporarily. And we'll look at Japanese isolationism more in Unit 4, actually. Let's pop on over to Korea and Japan, or Vietnam, I'm sorry. Korea, what's going on there? Well, Korea is actually going to be invaded by the Mongols, by the Yuan Dynasty in the 1270s. And this is going to have the kind of impact in that the Koreans will be closer to the Yuan Dynasty. They are going to be kind of a lot more close diplomatically, economically. The Koryo Kingdom, the Koryo Dynasty, they are going to marry into the Yuan Dynasty, actually, as a way to preserve some degree of self-independence for Korea. But eventually, we do see that the Mongols are kicked out. The Koryo Dynasty, they're going to reform as the Yi Dynasty. And the Yi Dynasty is going to kind of develop a close relationship with the Ming Dynasty. They're going to adopt Ming isolation practices. And we do see that the Koryo Kingdom is going to retain its isolation, but also at the same time, close relationship with China. We do see that Korea is going to actually engage in a lot of trade in China. We see a kind of intellectual and technological era in the Koryo Kingdom. We see kind of these advances in meteorology. We see the printing press as well. All of these things are going to kind of flourish in this 14th century golden age that Korea is going through. But how did they respond to the Mongols? Just to sum that up, well, they married into them. And then eventually, once the Mongols declined in China, they were kicked out, new family came into power. This new family, of course, is going to adopt actually Neo-Confucianism. Let's go to Vietnam real quick. Well, in Vietnam, we do see as well the Yuan Dynasty will invade. And they're going to kind of be reformed, organized into a unified state to be administered under the Yuan Dynasty. This state is eventually going to, it's by the name of Annam, so A-N-N-A-M, is going to be forced to pay tribute to the Yuan Dynasty and the Ming Dynasty as well. So this puppet state of Anan is going to be very, they don't really want to be under Chinese influence. So we do kind of see that while elites will adopt Neo-Confucianism, the majority of Vietnamese people don't want the Chinese presence there. We see a rejection of China in Vietnam. They want to retain their independence. All right, so what are some similarities in how Korea and Japan respond to the Mongols? All right, so Korea, more centralized, but also they kept their independence by marrying into the Mongol ruling family. There's this great Chinese animation. It's from China, so it's not. So Chinese animation, it's about Zheng He. It's funny. Anyway, that's all for today. Thank you, folks. Have a wonderful day. God. I don't know where I'm going with that. All right, have a great day, guys. Bye.